How's it going, everybody? And welcome to the MLB Draft Recap edition of the CLNS Roundtable for 2018. I'm Alex Barth, joined today by the executive editor of SoxProspects.com, and that is Chris Hatfield. Chris, thanks for joining us today.
Alex, it's a pleasure to be with you here from my hotel room in beautiful Central Islip. But, you know, the draft does not wait for us to have convenient times in our schedules, I guess.
The draft is not convenient at all. Round two went until like 1 in the morning. That thing really drags on. It seemed like this year more than other years. Before we get to, the specifics, I just want to get your opinion, big picture. How do you feel the Red Sox did? Your kind of instant reaction to their draft class.
Well, it's very interesting. You know, we cut a podcast after night one, myself and our director of scouting, Ian Kundle. And, our take on the first night's picks, which were third baseman Tristan Casas and outfielder Nick Decker, both a couple of high school players. And this trend kind of continued into day two, was that it's a very un-Red Sox draft when you've been watching what they do for a while, especially when you look at Casas and Decker and a couple guys they drafted on day two, catcher Cole Cottom out of Kentucky, and the first player they took on day three, who was a very highly ranked high school player out of Ohio, a third baseman by the name of Nick Northcutt. Their best tools are their raw power, and the question of whether the hit tool will get there for them to tap into it. That's very atypical for this club to hone in on guys like that. The other interesting thing is they didn't even take a starting pitcher until Brian Brown out of NC State in the 9th round. He's like I said, from NC State, had a great year in the first half, kind of stumbled a little bit in the second half, but he's a senior sign. He's not even, he's a guy that they're looking to save money on probably. The other pitchers they drafted on days 1 and 2, or actually both on day 2, were right-hander out of TCU by the name of Durbin Feltman and a right-hander out of Central Florida named Thad Ward. They're both relievers. And, even though they took Feltman in the 3rd round, they took a college closer in Sean Anderson out of the University of Florida previously with the idea of moving him into the rotation. If you look at Feltman pitch, there's no way he's starting. It's a violent delivery. He, has this weird tick where he brings the ball out and back into his glove as he's pitching. It's just, it's not a type of player you're going to move to starting. And he was seen by some, including Jim Callis of MLB.com, whose stuff we're really big fans of, seen as the guy in this draft who could move to the majors the fastest. So you wonder, was he maybe a guy who they thought they could fast track to the majors to help that bullpen as early as maybe end of this year if they make a playoff run? You could dream on that. If not, then certainly maybe next year if they keep him in the bullpen with a 70 fastball and a 70 breaking ball. But maybe getting a little bit ahead of myself, those were kind of the two really atypical Red Sox trends that we saw this year. And maybe the third one, just really quickly, was the fact that they had a lot of money, perhaps, we think, projecting roughly what we think guys will get from the first couple of days of the draft. Might have a little bit of money left over to sign some guys over slot that they took today on day 3, which is not necessarily something they always do, at least more than, a few $1,000s here or there. So those were all kind of interesting and a little bit atypical, and you wonder if that might be in part in reaction to the state of the farm system right now, because it's definitely not pretty down on the farm right now.
And that's kind of what I wanted to ask you about, specifically these top 2 picks, Casas and Decker. They seem like high ceiling picks, but guys who are going to take a while, coming out of high school, described as very raw. Are you surprised that they went with such a project in those spots, given that, their 5th outfielder right now may as well be Rusney Castillo? They don't really have any guys behind those at the major league level. And now these guys they took probably won't get there for a while.
Yeah, well, I think the first thing I would say in response to that, let's not confuse having raw power with being raw. These are guys who, yes, they're high schoolers and they'll take a certain amount of development time because of the fact they're high schoolers, but they're not guys that are necessarily raw development projects. Both of them are described as having advanced plate approaches for high school players. It's all relative, of course, but they're not necessarily seen as project type guys. Casas looks like a guy who might get a little bit over slot value for the 26th pick overall is 2.5, a little over 2.5 million. Decker's pick at pick 64, I think, was the last pick with a 7-figure slot value. It's a little over 1 million. I think it's 1 million, 10 grand. So those are guys, yes, they're high schoolers. Yes, they'll take the requisite amount of time. They'll go level by level. as opposed to, say, an Andrew Benintendi, who tore through the system after being drafted 7th overall out of Arkansas. But, those are guys that they're not necessarily raw projects. For the other half of that, my response is that really, even with college guys, you can't count on someone to do an Andrew Benintendi and tear through the system the way he did. Even the guys that move the quickest, save for maybe the Durbin Feltman types who I just talked about, of course, they're going to take 2 or 3 years before they get to the majors, even if things go perfectly. So drafting for need at the MLB level right now is not something you'll see teams do usually, even the Red Sox. The fact is, if you have a need at the major league level, you can address that by trading a player lower in the minors. So, as needs come up, you don't necessarily need this round peg to fit the round hole. Sometimes you can take the square peg and trade it for the round peg, so to speak.
And obviously, it's a best player available, like you said, in the MLB draft. But it was interesting to see the Red Sox take 2 catchers on day 2. They took one, I got to double check here, in the 4th round in Cole Cottom, and in the 8th round in Eli Marrero. That's not really a position where, if both guys progress, they can do it simultaneously. A lot of the guys they took could play multiple positions. Catcher is not necessarily the same. Are you surprised that they invested so heavily in the catcher position early in the draft?
Yes and no. It's kind of interesting. Again, best player available, so I don't think it has to do with what's going on at the major league level by any stretch. Certainly the system doesn't have a lot of catching depth, and I think that's a big part of why the Red Sox have tried to hold on to Blake Swihart as long as they can. The fact that he was probably the move instead of Hanley Ramirez when Pedroia came off the DL until about 2 days before. Let's put that aside. The fact is they almost need Swihart in case either Vasquez or Leon gets hurt, right? Because they don't have anything in AAA right now that they can come up with. We've got some guys there who are having decent seasons, Mike Ullman, and Dan Butler's a guy that's been around, but there's not really anything there. Cottom is interesting. He was the 4th round pick out of Kentucky that I mentioned. He's actually better known for his bat rather than his glove. Another raw power guy, which again, not the kind of catcher we're used to this organization picking in the draft. So that was kind of a pick. He'll probably go to Lowell, one would assume, and work his way up. We'll see if he sticks. I believe I had read about him that he went into Kentucky better on his glove, but kind of came out the other way around, where he's better known for his bat. Marrero is interesting. Another college catcher. He's actually Devin Marrero's cousin, former 1st round pick of the Red Sox, obviously sent to Arizona this past offseason for a player to be named who is a AA reliever. Maybe they just had a quota on guys named Marrero in the system. He's actually probably going to be at the same level as another catcher named Alan Marrero, which is going to be brutal for whatever media guys at that level to figure out who's in at a given time potentially. But yeah, he's a guy who, as an 8th round pick, yes, he's a junior, but I can't see them drafting him unless they were planning perhaps on saving a little bit of money on that slot. Slot for the 8th round is $157K. He might not get the 5 or 10 grand that they'll give to college seniors, but I doubt he gets more than 50 or maybe 75. He's a guy who wasn't really ranked by either Baseball America or Perfect Game, who ranked 500 deep. So it'll be interesting to see what he gets. I think that's really just kind of more of a minor league depth pick, if I'm being honest. They took at least one more catcher today, a guy out of Oklahoma, a senior out of Oklahoma City College. So again, I think another depth pick. So, it'll be interesting to see how they address the catcher position. They have a lot of guys percolating up from the Dominican Summer League and their Latin signings. They, of course, signed a Tibetan catcher this offseason by the name of Justin Chungba. Which is kind of, I think, more of a curiosity than anything at this point, but it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. But a couple catchers on day 2 was interesting, but it's, again, atypical for them.
It's easy for players to get buried in a draft like this. 40 rounds, I think it's 1,200 picks. Outside of the guys at the top, are there any names, any stories, any highlights that are maybe getting buried that Red Sox fans, especially those who, frequent your site, who like to monitor the minor leagues, should keep an eye on?
Sure. Well, the interesting thing for me coming out of day 3 will be whether they sign the 11th round pick, Nick Northcutt. He was a top 100 draft prospect across MLB, Baseball America, and Perfect Games rankings. Again, another power guy. The thing with him is he's a Vanderbilt commit, and if you follow the draft for any length of time, you know that a Vanderbilt commit may as well be a contract signed in like blood for your firstborn or something. It seems like a lot of those guys do go to college. The Red Sox, like I said, we project that, very rough estimate, so don't hold us to this, they might have as much as about 850 grand over slot that the Red Sox can give a player after the 10th round. Slot for after the 10th round is 125,000. So 125,000 and under doesn't count towards your draft bonus cap. Above 125,000 does count. It'll be interesting to see if they were trying to save money for a guy like Northcutt, because that'd be a great way to infuse some talent into the system. So he's a really interesting guy. Seeing whether they sign him or not, because I think they'll sign everyone from days 1 and 2. I think that kind of goes without saying at this point with the Red Sox. And it actually does sound like Casas and Decker are going to sign relatively quickly for guys picked on day 1. So that's really the will they or won't they sign him story. I mentioned Cole Cottom. He's a really interesting guy. He wore the number 13 in college at Kentucky because he's had 13 surgeries on his eye. He was born with, I don't want to get it wrong, but some kind of a, not a congenital defect, but some kind of condition where he's had a number of surgeries on that eye. The vision is fine, apparently, at this point. I mean, the dude hit 352 in the Southeastern Conference. So that's the best college conference in the country. So if he hit over 350 in the SEC, he can see. He's fine. But that's kind of a neat story to see if he's a guy who will, be able to fight through that adversity and make it to the majors. A couple other interesting guys that they drafted. Devlin Granberg, the 6th round pick out of Dallas Baptist. Senior sign, but a guy who they might give a little bit of money. I saw him compared to kind of like the newest version of Kevin Youkilis out of college. I hate throwing comps on guys because people get the wrong idea. You say a guy might become someone and they say, he's the next blank. No, that's not what I'm saying, but it's just kind of an atypical, atypical profile. And I guess another thing that we've seen the Red Sox really heavily invest in this year based on what we're hearing is the hitters, who, by the way, I didn't even mention this, they went really heavy on the position player side, just generally, never mind not drafting starting pitching, which they seem to have completely punted on at this point, on exit velocities, as we're starting to see TrackMan set up at high school invitational tournaments and showcases and things like that. A lot of these guys they drafted, even the college guys, are high exit velocity guys. So are they really starting to change their draft philosophy? That's maybe a longer term storyline, but it's something that we're going to be watching in the next couple of years to see is, TrackMan and things like that, and maybe rethinking some of the conventional wisdom on, does it make sense to draft a mediocre starting pitcher in the 5th round who you're going to move to the bullpen anyway, when you could instead draft a guy like Durbin Feltman, who's got 2 potentially double plus pitches right now, who could maybe come up to the major leagues later this year, early next year, and slot right into a setup role for you when that's what the starting anyway, and except for the 5% chance he turns into, of course, Jalen Beeks on the night night before he's going to start. Is that calculus something we're going to start seeing them play a little with? So again, maybe a longer term thing, but I don't know whether this is just how the draft fell for them this year or if they're changing how they do things.
Again, he is Chris Hatfield from SoxProspects.com. How quick do these guys get up on your website, Chris?
We've got a whole crew of guys at SoxProspects.com. I'm looking at our draft page right now. We've got through pick number 32. I think they were a little past that. We've got player profile pages up on the first 10 rounds worth of picks. That's 10 guys this year. Some years it's a little more, some years a little less, depending on whether they've gained or lost picks for qualifying offer guys. But we've got, like I said, player profiles up on the first 10. As guys sign, we'll get player pages up on them as well. Level of information differs on, from player to player. There's not a lot out there on some guys, but we try and update as quickly as possible. Check news.soxprospects.com for all of the news on signings and things like that. As guys who maybe go to Lowell are playing when Ian Kundle or Chaz Fiorino, our 2 scouts, see them, they'll write them up, put them on there too if you're looking for drafted player scouting reports, and of course, the rest of our scouting content. We've got a scouting report up right now on tomorrow night's starter and Jalen Beeks. So a lot of great content on there. And, of course, at Sox Prospects on Twitter.
There you go. Check it all out. Chris, thanks for taking the time.
Thanks a lot.